Funding for Lost 50s is provided by the citizens of Minnesota through the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund.
This is no simple car. It's a time machine that takes riders on a sentimental journey. America in the 1950s was marked by optimism, where young families found opportunity and new technologies made the future seem unlimited.
The era seemed so prosperous. People with good paying jobs, steel plant jobs, mining jobs, were able to afford cabins, boats, cars.
Yet the 50s were also a time of trepidation, with the Cold War and the threat of nuclear attack in the background of everyday life.
And the two fighter squadrons at Duluth were both armed with nuclear weapons.
Northern Minnesota played an increasingly important role in the nation's defense system, a fact most local citizens were unaware of. Times were changing, with rock and roll music, drive-in movies and restaurants, and an increasingly mobile society.
But the kinds of things we did were very 1950s. So I guess people can think that everything they read about the 1950s, a lot of it's true.
See the USA in your Chevrolet. America is asking you to call. Drive your Chevrolet through the USA. America's the greatest land of all. So make a date today to see the USA. See it in your Chevrolet.
The United States was car crazy in the 1950s. Fed by pent-up demand in the post-World War II years, Americans fell in love with the big, powerful Detroit-bred automobile. A new era of freedom and luxury was as close as your local car dealer.
There he comes now in his merry Oldsmobile. It's a futuramic Oldsmobile with the newest push-button features. Automatic windows, automatic top.
Car companies were quick to capitalize on the newfound sense of American optimism, encouraging upwardly moving young families to think big.
Like so many people these days, we live in the suburbs, and Dave needs the car every day for business. When he was gone, I was practically a prisoner in my own home, but that's all changed now. 3 weeks ago, we bought another Ford, the new low-priced custom-line Victoria. Isn't it stunning? Dave has it all to himself, and I now have the ranch wagon all to myself. It's a whole new way of life.
The car companies were putting out, started putting out cars with great big fins on them and things. Cars were so important. I think at all strata of society, people with money would get their Cadillacs and Buicks, but everybody seemed to want a nice car.
The growing American car culture made a major impact on the young men of the 50s.
There was a man that lived across the street from my parents' house who had a 38 Plymouth that was just beautiful. And I just asked him, why do you always wash and polish your car? And he says, pride of ownership, Walter, pride of ownership.
That's Walt Petrowski's 57 Chevrolet Bel Air, a car he fell in love with while growing up in the 50s. On a beautiful late summer drive through West Duluth's Lincoln Park, he reminisced about the car that has been such a big part of his life.
And I was lucky enough to have a new car when I was young, and I always wanted it back again, and the opportunity came and I bought it. And it'll be with me until I'm no longer around. Too many wonderful memories. I love driving it. I love the feel. It puts me back in my childhood again, in my mind's eye.
Today, nostalgia toward the golden age of American automobiles remains strong. And these works of art in steel and chrome still turn heads and stir emotions.
They do have a character of their own, Whether it's a Chevy, Ford, anything, they all had their own character.
Everybody knew what the cars were, the years, the makes, the models.
I get more fun out of having people look at my car and enjoying it as much as I do. You know, I'm not in it for showing off or anything.
It's fun when you go to a restaurant, you look out the window and people are standing there taking pictures.
At car shows like this one at Gordy's in Cloquet, many of the vintage vehicles have a direct connection to their owners' formative years. And that makes a good old-fashioned drive-in the perfect place for car lovers to gather.
Gordy, for years, has had the old-time cars come in to kind of celebrate him taking over the Ripper stand back in the 50s. And so he just keeps it going every year.
The local drive-in was a popular destination for the newly mobile teenagers of the 1950s. And Duluth had a couple of places that attracted the young crowd.
There were two major drive-ins in Duluth for young people in the 50s. One was the A&W, now called A&Dubs. It still operates down by the Yordogs. And and the other was the London Inn on London Road.
It usually moved from one drive-in to the other, from A&W in the West End by the Yordogs, out to Ritchie's Drive-In by Morgan Park, out to where Lemon Drop Hill is now. There was a drive-in there. It was like a bunch of amoebas going around through town.
Oftentimes with very, very loud mufflers. And you know, they were just in there showing off their cars and making circles.
Young men in their cars seemed to gravitate to the drive-ins, a place to show off their fancy rides to the girls. And the cute car hops likely kept them coming back for more burgers and shakes. In fact, girls and cars were probably the top topics when the guys got together at their car clubs back then.
The club idea was to help people in need, other drivers. Somebody had a flat tire, we'd stop and change it for them, or whatever they needed, we'd take care of it. It depended on your locale which club you would join, and we happened to be in West Duluth, West End, so we were called the Regents, and I suppose we had 30 or 40 members. A lot of the guys didn't have cars, but they still came down and hung around the garage.
With more and more cars out on the road, Americans were taking hold of a new lifestyle of drive-up convenience, including the latest craze, drive-in movies.
Good evening, folks, and a hearty welcome to our drive-in theater. We have a wonderful evening's entertainment lined up for you, one that will provide several hours of pleasurable relaxation and diversion for you and your family. Did you fail to dress up for tonight's show? No tie, an old shirt and slacks, a house dress? Well, don't give it a thought. We're glad you came as you are.
In and around Duluth, the place to come as you are was the Skyline Drive-In on Miller Trunk Highway. Starting in 1948, you could pull in for a night of full-service movie entertainment.
I think it was on concrete, so, you know, they'd drive on either side. It's just like a ticket booth when you are on the highway. Then the girls are standing outside, and then they get the money and go back to the cashier to get the ticket and then give it to them in the car. And you didn't have to get out of the car.
At the time, drive-in theaters like Skyline had attendants to direct you and help attach the speaker that provided personal in-car audio.
No traffic problems, no parking problems. The boys will help you park. This is me. I was a ticket girl for a couple of years, and then I was a cashier for a couple of years.
One of the first employees at the ultra-modern attraction, Delane Carlson of Hermantown, was proud to have a job where you dressed like a big city usherette.
It was elaborate. I thought that was pretty classy. We had offices underneath the screen so that we would go in and change into our uniform. Had a hat besides the cape, and the shirt was made out of satin shirt with a cape and pants. They were blue. Yeah, pretty snazzy. It was my first job, don't forget. 1948, I was in the 11th grade.
She worked summers through high school and beyond, and the theater was never far away. In fact, it sat adjacent to Delane's home on the family's former farmstead.
My dad was a farmer, and he had a lot of open land there, right on the highway. It would be good access coming in from the Miller Trunk. Ted Mann was the guy that bought the land.
Mann was a movie theater mogul who started in Minnesota, building a handful of giant tilted outdoor screens across the state. Later, he went on to fame as the one-time owner of the Chinese Theater on Hollywood Boulevard. But back in his early business days, he was very hands-on.
Mr. Mann would come to the house and make his payments.
At the drive-in movie, you could bring the kids in their pajamas. Bottle warmers were provided for babies. Most theaters had a playground up front for fun time before the show began. You were always enticed to check out concession stand fare, but could still watch the screen for a countdown to showtime. While the drive-in movie was a great draw for families, it also attracted a lot of teenagers.
They packed them in. They'd put them in the trunk of the car or cover them up laying on the floor in the back seat. Or a lot of kids snuck in. Yeah, we knew it.
And the managers of drive-in theaters took notice of all the teen couples out on a date. As the years went by, Skyline made changes and upgrades, but like most drive-in theaters across the region and throughout the country, it too succumbed to the new habits of audiences. The final film was projected on the big outdoor screen at Skyline Drive-In Theater in August of 1986. In 1956, the city of Duluth went all out to celebrate its centennial. Residents of the Zenith City were encouraged to dress as the pioneers would have a century earlier. And facial hair was encouraged among the men of the city.
All manner of celebrations went on in Duluth, and the men, women, and children got into the act, and we all grew beards. The men grew beards, I had a little Van Dyke, little goatee. It was a huge, huge event all summer long. Churches and schools and businesses all over town did different things on their own to commemorate the 100 years anniversary of Duluth.
One of the highlights of the year was a parade featuring marching bands from every local high school, including Morgan Park. And of course, there were beauty queens, familiar Zenith City businesses, and a float powered in a most unusual manner. The Twin Ports Oilmen's Club float was pulled by a pair of bears, a sight many parade watchers would recall with wonder years later. At the dawn of the 50s, companies were prospering. For decades, the red ores found on the Vermilion, Cuyuna, and Mesabi ranges played an instrumental role in growing the United States.
Iron ore unlimited in the Lake Superior ranges that have furnished 3 billion tons of ore for its most brilliant century. 3 billion tons to make 80% of the steel that built this nation.
But there were storm clouds on the horizon for the region's cornerstone industry.
But more and more, the troubled questions buzz around the state. Can it continue? Is there any future in iron ore?
As the high-grade ore was beginning to play out, hard times came to the region.
Then came days of unemployment. Faltering markets hurt the ranges. Men of iron lost their income. Supporting business shared the fate.
While the purest ore bodies were nearly gone, University of Minnesota researchers were working on a way to economically mine a lower grade ore called taconite. Millions of tons of the hard rock lay just below the surface.
The iron mineral remains scattered through a rock, hard enough to cut glass. A rock that has lain undisturbed for 1 billion years, but we're disturbing it now.
The shattered rock was scooped up and hauled to a processing plant. Through a series of crushing and concentrating machines, a higher grade ore was extracted from the taconite, and a new era of mining began on the Iron Range.
The fight to make our low-grade ores usable is the largest mining project of all time. It speaks of a great faith in Minnesota iron ore mining and promises a great future.
With a proven method of extracting the valuable ore, massive new plants were soon under construction. The reserve mining operation on the eastern Mesabi was a $180 million investment at the beginning of the decade. A mine and crushing plant was built in Babbitt, along with a new town site to house the workers. The taconite was then shipped by rail, some 40 miles, to the new town site of Silver Bay, where a fine crushing and pelletizing plant was built on the north shore of Lake Superior. New loading facilities and a harbor for the giant ships that carry the ore completed the enormous investment. While much of that ore went to steel plants out east, the 1950s were a boom time for U.S. Steel's American Steel and Wire plant.
You might even say that the 1950s were the golden age of the U.S. Steel operations in Duluth, because there were some almost 4,000 workers employed, which meant that it was by far the largest employer in Duluth. And furthermore, the workers were very well paid.
The plant in western Duluth took the raw ore and made it into wire and nails. At full production, the facility turned out 150 million nails and 21,000 miles of steel wire every week. Employees were proud of the work they did and of the community of Morgan Park, where many of them lived. In 1956, on the 125th anniversary of steel wire manufacturing in America, U.S. Steel officials held an open house so the public could see how it manufactured its steel products.
They went through a great effort to clean up the steel plant, paint it in many areas, put in lights so that people could see every nook and cranny in the plant, and then they opened it up, and they were preparing for a smaller number, and tens of thousands of people came.
The open house was a high point in the history of the plant because soon it would be struggling. With U.S. Steel unwilling to invest in the aging plant, its final days were marked, and the facility was closed in stages beginning in late 1971. But the great industries of iron mining and steel weren't the only ones making products in the region. The Minnesota Woolen Company had earned quite a reputation for itself in the clothing business. With products made in Duluth and delivered directly to the customer by United States Mail, it was an impressive operation.
Order envelopes which come from all over the country. Sack after sack after sack.
Minnesota Woolen was the largest direct-to-consumer clothing company in the nation and employed hundreds in Duluth and hundreds of salespeople across the U.S. The company did such a high volume of sales that the post office had to put on an extra evening shift to handle the parcels from Minnesota Woolen.
This is the main Duluth Post Office. This is a building your company helped to build, and it is due to the tremendous volume of business of the Minnesota Woolen Company, of which you as a part, that we have such a large post office in the city of Duluth. It is Christmas every day at the Duluth Post Office when Minnesota Woolen ships.
WEBC, Chapel 56.
Gathering round the radio to hear a favorite program was a nightly ritual in American homes, and the place to turn your ear for news updates during World War II.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii by air, President Roosevelt has just announced.
Post-war, the radio remained essential, even as America and the world was quickly changing. Men like Glenn Maxam were returning from duty overseas and looking for work.
When I came here, it was right after getting out of the military service and after having served in Japan in Armed Forces Radio for a year and a half. And I found that at that time, the economy in general was very poor in Minnesota, everywhere. And so jobs were very hard to find.
With broadcasting experience earned during his stint in the military, Glenn landed a job at a struggling Twin Ports radio station.
What had once been a wonderful station, WEBC, the biggest north of the Twin Cities and the best, it was deteriorating.
WEBC's studio was located in the old Palladio building on Superior Street in downtown Duluth. Not long after Glenn came on board, a change in management signaled brighter days ahead.
Bob Rich had taken over the station operation, and he got it going again. And Bob came up with the idea that many will remember of the traffic tower, which was a glass enclosed structure on top of the WEBC building overlooking Superior Street. And I thought that was a brilliant idea. The announcer could tell exactly what's happening with the weather. You know, oh, here comes the rain. Well, otherwise, almost in every other station, there's no window.
Radio stations like WEBC and their chief competitor, WDSM, kept listeners up to date with the latest information. But in the early 1950s, a new technological marvel was about to change American habits permanently. This little rectangular box with the funny antenna on top matched moving pictures with sound. The television would soon have a profound impact on the American way of life. As the hottest new electronic device, no home could be without. In the Northland, the first TV programs were barely discernible amidst the snowy, grainy reception. The closest TV signals were from the Twin Cities, making reception in northeastern Minnesota sketchy under the best conditions. But that began to change in 1953, when the first Duluth television station went on the air.
The first television station went on the air, Channel 38, while I was working at WEBC. The scramble to get on the air was really intense. And there was another station that attempted to get on the air.
With much fanfare, WFTV Channel 38 had its inaugural broadcast on the afternoon of June 7, 1953. The station shared studio space with WEBC in the Palladio building downtown. That piece of regional history, which saw so many broadcast firsts, was lost to the wrecking ball in the summer of 2014. During the first year of television broadcasts, WFTV and WEBC Radio forged a partnership which gave Glenn Maxam his first taste of the TV business.
In fact, some of my copy went to a man named Ernie Orchard, who was the anchor man for Channel 38. So in a sense, part of me at least was on early television here.
Despite the anticipation and excitement over WFTV, the station was doomed to failure. Assigned an ultra-high frequency channel by the Federal Communications Commission, early TVs had to be set up with a special tuner to receive a signal. Soon, another TV station came on the scene, and within 1 year, WFTV had gone off the air. The new kid, WDSM-TV, was assigned Channel 6, a more favorable VHF frequency.
I'm Bob Ball, the news director for station WDSM-TV in Duluth Superior.
The station went on the air on March 1st, 1954, with news anchor Bob Ball working out of a makeshift studio at the TV station's tower site. In an interview recorded in 2005, Ball recalled those early working conditions.
Then I would put my script together and drive up on top of the hill, and they had craned out a corner of the garage where the station wagon was and put a desk in there and a fake bookcase behind me and a few bright lights, and that was my place for the broadcast from. And I did that for 2 years.
This rare film footage from WDSM-TV in the mid-1950s allows a glimpse into the early days of television news.
We're not a big outfit like some of the mammoth TV plants in the Twin Cities with scads of cameramen and thousands of dollars worth of gear. I'm a one-man news department as far as writing is concerned. Do all my writing for the 2 news shows a day, 6 and 10 p.m., 5 days a week.
In those early years, WDSM-TV was licensed in Superior, Wisconsin, requiring some of the news broadcasts to originate from a studio there.
Sometimes I'd go to Superior and do the job over there, but that was in the days when the bridge would open up and let marine traffic in and out, and sometimes I'm sitting at the edge of the bridge, it's open, it's 5 to 10, and I can't get into Superior to do it from the Superior studio.
Experienced newsmen like Glenn Maxam were in demand. After reviving WEBC Radio, new WDSM-TV owner Bob Rich asked Maxam to move to television.
He wanted me to come over there and be an anchor man. Well, I hadn't a day experience in a studio. So I left radio on a Friday. Monday I'm on the air as an anchor man.
With the growing success of VHF TV stations like WDSM and KDAL-TV, viewers across the region were buying televisions and getting the news in a way only television could deliver.
We give the basic facts of many stories, covering as much ground as possible in each show. Then, of course, we use the sound-on-film clip in the live interview, and thus do what only TV can do, bring the dimensions of sight and sound and motion to the news program.
The U.S. Air Force and the Air National Guard have made countless auspicious flights from Duluth. But they come from humble beginnings, with just a few dozen airmen and officers called together to serve. Nearly all of the 50 men were veterans of World War II. They would become the first unit of the Air National Guard at Duluth, Minnesota. And within a few short years, their group was commanded to protect the nation from nuclear attack. Initially, the base was no more than an inadequate runway and a couple of old WPA shacks left over from the Depression-era Workers' Progress Administration. But by 1951, construction of a modernized base was well underway, and none too soon.
In 1951, the Air Guard was activated at Duluth for 1 year to stand air defense alert against the growing Soviet threat from long-range bombers.
As a former longtime pilot and commander of both the Duluth and the Minnesota Air National Guard, Klazowski knows well the history of its mission.
In the country's mind was the sneak attack on Pearl Harbor, the fact that we weren't able to stop it, didn't know it was coming, and the damage that occurred there and the lives that were lost. The nuclear weapon on Japan had appeared in Life magazine, the destructive capability of that. And also the Soviet Union exploded a nuclear weapon in 1949 and had a long-range bomber.
Air defense would take top priority. In the early to mid-50s, that meant literally watching the skies. Civilian volunteers stood atop observation posts with binoculars, trained and ready to report any looming threat.
We didn't have any way to shoot down the bombers, and we didn't have any way to detect them other than during daylight hours when there were no clouds. From the northern parts of the Soviet Union across the Bering Straits, they could fly that airplane down to our industrial centers and our population centers, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, back in those days before they were the Rust Belt. Duluth's location was exactly underneath that route. And so Duluth quickly developed into a major strategic air defense location. Towns in Minnesota and Wisconsin, because of the strategic route, we built a radar station at Finland, Minnesota, critical, in 1951. 1958, Baudette. There were radar stations at Calumet, Michigan, Wadena, Minnesota, Rochester, Minnesota, Houghton Hancock. And prior to the Sage building, each of those radar stations fought the little air battle in their area within a 200-mile radius.
The Air Force Base at Finland was staffed by more than 100 guards over the course of its operation, and some 350 people lived in the often frigid, remote post during the Cold War. But the human element would soon be helped along by the very latest machine technology.
Today, we must be on guard in the sky when it comes to protecting our resources. The national resources that are so precious to us.
The computer started to be invented, so to speak, or improved, and IBM came in with a proposal for an air defense system called Semi-Automatic Ground Environment, or SAGE.
One of only 22 facilities like it in the entire country, a SAGE building was proposed for Duluth and under construction by 1956.
Electronics for combat use means new concepts, new tools, new weapons. You are listening to the heartbeat of the SAGE computer. And this computer is on the job around the clock with 24-hour-a-day reliability. All this is housed in one of the new headquarters of computer defense, one of the direction centers of what the Air Force calls SAGE.
They developed two computers that would take all the data coming from outlying radar stations, take all the data from the fighters that were on alert, meld it into one, and put it in a place where individuals can control an air battle from Hudson's Bay all the way down to Kansas City, and from the border of North and South Dakota all the way over to Lake Michigan. And that was Duluth's area of responsibility. So it was a massive air defense system. No expense was spared. I mentioned before, you know, the cost of the SAGE system in the air defense exceeded that of the Manhattan Project, developing the atomic bomb for Hiroshima. The atomic bomb at Hiroshima was 16 kilotons, and the amount of weaponry we had here, total explosive power, was 16 times greater than that.
Duluth's SAGE system coordinated not only defensive efforts, but also the signals and orders for retaliation.
And the two fighter squadrons at Duluth were both armed with nuclear weapons, with the Genie. It was called the Genie. It was the Air 2A. It was a 1.7 kiloton weapon warhead. All those weapons were stored at Duluth in a secure storage area, guarded by sentry dogs, electronic intrusion alarms, and every 3 or 4 months the Air Force would declare a simulated war. So those nuclear weapons would come out of the storage site, the actual weapons, and they would be brought down the runway to the guard base and to the Air Force base, and all the airplanes would be loaded with that weaponry, and we had 3 hours to do it.
In addition to the Genie warhead, an unmanned state-of-the-art nuclear weapon was in development in the early 1950s, and would make its way to the Northland and be controlled through the Sage computer system. On a wooded ridge just north of Duluth and not far from Lake Superior, a unique facility was being built to house some of the world's most advanced anti-aircraft missiles. This is the Beaumark Missile Site, once an active Cold War Air Force station. Some 50 years later, the 28 individual launch shelters that held the world's first long-range missiles sit neatly intact in orderly rows. Each was constructed with heavy-grade steel and cement and engineered with hydraulics to hold and, if need be, to launch a supersonic, combat-ready missile.
The Beaumark is a defense missile that can be fired by remote control from hundreds of miles away. Its accuracy is incredible. A hangar opens. A supersonic Beaumark ground-to-air interceptor missile is set in firing position. The Beaumark climbs skyward from its launcher.
The missile was armed with either 1,000 pounds of conventional warhead or 3 to 7 kiloton nuclear warhead. And all that was up at the North Shore, about 15 miles away. So you would have somebody come from downtown, a civilian, his neighbor would never know that he was pulling nuclear alert. Well, there were 1,000 people in Duluth associated with the Air National Guard that were involved in that critical aspect.
Do you think the general public was aware of that?
Totally unaware. Totally unaware. And that was the way it probably needed to be. Given the times, we were having our disagreement with the Soviets in many, many areas. And the public was more aware of the tensions in the world at that time, but they were not aware that Duluth was such a key part of that Cold War.
The former Sage building has been reconfigured and now serves as a natural resources research facility for the University of Minnesota Duluth. The former Beaumark missile site is now a manufacturing and warehousing operation. Just outside the Union Depot in downtown Duluth sits an often overlooked bronze casting. This sculpture is a tribute to the last surviving Union soldier of the Civil War, Albert Wolson, who moved to Duluth in 1905 and stayed until his death in 1956. By that time, he was the last of more than 2.6 million boys in blue who served in the Civil War.
He would get very excited in recounting his time. He was a drummer boy, and he would talk about the battles.
Enlisting at the age of 17 in October of 1864, Wolson served in the 1st Minnesota Heavy Artillery Regiment in the Drum Corps and eventually became a drum major. By the 1950s, Wolson was more than 100 years old and had become a national celebrity, though he didn't seek the attention.
He was very often, probably too often, harassed by the media. We all wanted to talk to Albert. We all wanted interviews with him.
In an interview several years ago, pioneer Duluth television broadcaster Bob Ball recalled the media interest that grew with each passing year.
But every year, when he had a birthday, as he got older and older and older, you know, we knew he can't survive another year. This must be the year. Well, so on his birthday, the networks would send people out from the East Coast to commemorate the birthday.
On his 107th birthday, Wolson received thousands of cards, including one from President Eisenhower. As he aged, his legend as the last survivor of the Union Army was augmented by some tall tales told to eager visiting reporters.
But he would start to reminisce about Lincoln. And if the reporters didn't know this, they would egg him into this. Tell us about Abe Lincoln, Mr. Wilson. What's your memories of Abe? Oh, yes, Abe Lincoln, yes. Honest Abe. Oh, I remember him well. He'd say, I was in the room there, and I knew him. He come in. I knew him instantly. He had this beard and this long stovepipe hat on. it was all made up in his own head. But they dutifully took it all down and showed it on the air.
Wolson remained remarkably active until late in life, no doubt a factor in his outliving his Civil War brothers.
His daughter told me how active he was all the years leading up to that point, and she said that when he was 100, he was up on his roof shoveling the snow off. There are a lot of people I know wouldn't do it at 50.
But the inevitable end came for the last of the boys in blue. On August 3, 1956, Albert Wolson passed away in his sleep at St. Luke's Hospital. Just hours after his death, President Eisenhower issued a statement.
By the death of Albert Wolson, the American people have lost the last personal link with the Union Army. His passing brings sorrow to the hearts of all of us who cherish the memory of the brave men on both sides of the war between the states.
He was 109, I think it was, when he died. The oldest living survivor of the Union Civil War.
Wolson's funeral was held at the Duluth Armory, an event unprecedented in the city's history. 109 Army National Guardsmen, one for each year of his life, led the funeral procession as Wolson's body arrived at the armory.
I was up in the upper level where it was loaded, absolutely loaded with news people, with television, with radio, all the media. I think the New York Times was there, the Washington Post, Secretary of State, I don't remember, but top government officials, top military brass, and an amazing array of these high-level officers. And even today, when I think about it and talk about it, it brings a lump to my throat, because the most stirring part of that service was when there was a white-robed choir. I think there were 20 voices in their white robes. They sang the Battle Hymn of the Republic at his request. Boy, was that touching. Everybody had tears. I did. All the hard-bitten news reporters, they all were really moved by it.
Following the service, Wolson was saluted with a military flyover, and then the funeral party proceeded to Park Hill Cemetery.
The Duluth had never seen a lineup of a funeral procession of that dimension. I think it was at least 5 miles long. And all along the route, there were people at the intersections waving, saluting.
Finally, after 109 eventful years on Earth, the last surviving soldier of the Grand Army of the Republic was laid to rest.
I think I shook hands with history. And I really feel that, because think of it, this man who had lived through the Civil War and was still here.
Across the nation, as well as here in the Northland, the music of the times would alter the tastes and habits of young people and hugely influence their lives. The change was transformational.
The 50s are split right down the middle as far as I'm concerned. Before that, it was Patti Page singing Allegheny Moon, and then Elvis right after that. And, well, goodbye, old America.
We were dressed up and it was fun. Dressed up compared to what someone might wear as a teenager to a dance today.
On the Iron Range in Hibbing, they set up a youth center for the young revelers.
We went to what was called Teenage, and that was at the Hibbing Memorial Building. And that was a new big deal in the recent years, where they'd have a particular area of the memorial building where they had teenage dances and gatherings and really fun times.
There were few organized activities then, so kids would drive their cool cars and stroll up and down the main drag of Howard Street, or hit the scene for dancing and live music.
They would bring people in, but there would also be a lot of high school kids playing, and that was every Friday night. You went to, quote, Teenage. And Bob Dylan's band played there quite a bit.
Susan was a classmate of the music icon, who was known then as Bobby Zimmerman, and played hometown gigs with a band called the Golden Chords. At one particular event, Dylan and the band were the featured entertainment for intermission. From all across the region, young people also made their way to bigger venues, like the National Guard Armory in Duluth, to see some of the greatest acts and entertainers of their time.
Well, the Armory was really the center of the community for a number of decades, from when it was originally built in 1915 through the 1960s. Patsy Cline, Johnny Cash, the Beach Boys were here, John Philip Sousa was here, Bob Hope was here, Sonny and Cher were also here.
After a long and storied history, the Armory was shuttered in 1978 and fell into disrepair. The aura of this as a renowned site for celebrity performances might be hard to imagine today, but for local historians and disciples of music, this has become a place of hallowed ground. That's largely due to a concert in January of 1959, one of the biggest teenage music shows the Northland had ever seen.
The Winter Dance Party. And it was Buddy Holly and the Crickets, the Big Bopper, Richie Valens. And it was brought by the Lulato Bandwagon. And I'm sure it was a sellout, packed crowd. And it was a very fun, exciting evening, and a whole big slew of people from Hibbing were there. And as we did turn out for a lot of things there.
Buddy Holly was an incredibly talented rising star when he played in Duluth.
Buddy Holly was getting really big. He was on his way up. We were lucky to get him. Girls were screaming and all of that. And I couldn't figure out why. Who's this kind of geeky guy in like big horn-rimmed glasses? But he had good music.
Just 2 days after the Duluth Winter Dance Party, Holly, the Big Bopper, and Richie Valens were killed in a plane crash in what became famously known as the day the music died. But the music did live on through Hibbing's Bob Dylan, and that gathering at the Armory is part of the reason why. That night, a young Bob Dylan made his way to the front of the stage. Dylan later recounted the experience in a speech at the Grammy Awards while accepting for Album of the Year in 1998.
I happened to be watching the Grammys that night, and what he said was, this album had Buddy Holly, I'm paraphrasing, of course, Buddy Holly as my muse.
Dylan's exact words were, "I went to see Buddy Holly play at the Duluth National Guard Armory. I was 3 feet away from him, and he looked at me. I don't know how or why, but I know he was with us all the time we were making this record." Dylan's memories of that fateful night in 1959 have ensured that despite the passing of time and the untimely death of some great talents, the Winter Dance Party will not be forgotten.
for me, it just gives me the shivers just to be on the stage and to know that, you know, there were, you know, 3 Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, you know, musicians on this stage, and one out in the audience being inspired by, you know, what was happening here. It just really is a moment in rock and roll history.
Efforts to restore the Duluth National Guard Armory as the Armory Arts and Music Center are ongoing. For generations, natives and immigrants have taken their sustenance from the shining Big Sea water and made their living off its harvest. There have been several commercial fishing operations along the north shore of Lake Superior. The family of Walt Sve runs one of them. Walt's father came from Norway. Walt himself has spent most of his 86 years plying the Great Lake, at times with great success.
They settled here for the commercial fishing, mainly herring fishing. Between my dad and Leonard and I, many days we had a ton of herring. One day, that was in 52. That's when we had our biggest lift. I came in with 2,200 pounds in my boat alone, and they had 1,700 each. And that's one day's catch.
But that bounty was not to last. By late that decade, the weight of their nets had lightened dramatically. Sve says the taconite operation just north of his home was mostly to blame.
When the reserves started dumping their tailings in the lake, that's destroyed the fishing. It was 30 years they dumped in the lake, and it was about 25 years that we never got a herring out here.
Early on, commercial fishing outfits had found ways to supplement their seasonal income with vacation cabins. In 1932, the Sves began building cabins just south of the Split Rock Lighthouse.
And it was the commercial fishermen that started the resort business, because for a little extra money. Right after the war is when it really got busy, because people had money, they had gasoline, and could get a car.
Vacationing Americans were helped along by the new attention to bigger and better infrastructure. In 1956, President Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act, creating the U.S. interstate system. It was hailed as one of the greatest public works projects ever. The interstate would reshape the landscape of the nation and infuse the culture with a roving spirit, as newly mobile Americans made their way further and further from home.
We took a lot of trips back in those days, cars with no air conditioning, 8 people in the car, squished in the car. I had 6 sisters and a brother, and we were always fighting for the motels with a swimming pool. So, but yeah, those were the good old days.
Like the Andersons, many were packing up the car, heading east and west to explore the countryside both near and far. Soon, middle-class families were taking annual treks to places like the North Shore for both respite and recreation. Tourism in these parts has been booming ever since. At Split Rock Cabins, vacationers and their families return year after year. Walt Sve is still fishing and out on the lake every day.
Parents came, of course they've probably been gone for years, but then their kids come, now their grandchildren come, and now even some of their great-grandchildren are coming. I never get tired of it. I thank God every day that I can live in a place like this. And it's such a beautiful plot. It really is. The whole North Shore is beautiful. And I don't think there's any place I'd rather live.
It was always the Great Lake that drew the voyagers, traders, and settlers. But there were those who hoped to see the pull of the inland sea become even greater. They wanted world commerce to reach the shores of the Great Lakes and ultimately make its way to the most inner port of Duluth Superior. For decades, efforts were underway to link our inland port to the Atlantic Ocean, 2,342 miles away. It would prove to be not only a major engineering, technological, and financial feat, but a political challenge as well.
I supported and spoke for it in 1954 in the Senate, and there was a good many people in the New England states and the eastern coast who felt that the development of the Seaway would mean that we would be bypassed. I don't think in the long run that that's going to happen.
When Duluth newsman Glenn Maxim interviewed then-Senator John Kennedy, he acknowledged that business interests near the nation's capital had been opposed to stretching the waterway this far west. But forces at work in Canada and intense lobbying by Great Lakes officials saw Congress and the President finally approve legislation to make it happen. A major observance was planned for the official arrival of the first vessel to make its way from the open sea.
Well, of course, they'd been hoping for it for decades, and it finally opened in 1959, and the first ocean-going ships came through in that spring, and they had a big, big celebration here.
I remember the day the first ship came in the huge spray of water over the entrance, the canal, and all of the people standing on the ships, of course, got soaked, but it was quite a day. The Raymond de Larranaga, it was a British ship from Barry's Marks.
It's a vivid memory for a young Jerry Lawson who envisioned his future livelihood out on the water.
I used to ride my bike down to Canal Park, and it wasn't called Canal Park then, but down to the aerial bridge and watch the ships come in and out.
When the Ramon de Larranaga came in, he was among a crowd of nearly 4,000 people who cheered its arrival. The festivities would go on well into the summer. President Eisenhower wrote to congratulate Duluth citizens, saying Duluth is known for fortifying the American economy and strengthening its defense. And Eisenhower would meet that summer with the Queen of England for official binational opening ceremonies. Elizabeth II was touring Canada on the Royal Yacht Britannia as it made its way through the inland locks and channels of the Seaway. In the weeks that followed, dozens of salties made their way to the Twin Ports to do business at the new international seaport. Lawson says those were fiercely competitive times due to the huge economic impact.
It was almost like the Wild Wild West modernized. When a ship would come in a large group of ship chandlers, at that time there was probably half a dozen different companies that provided groceries and provisions to the ships. And at the bottom of the gangway, it was not unusual for fistfights to break out onto who was going to get up the gangway first and get to the captain first and get the order.
There were new and exotic cargoes making their way through the Twin Ports, and mammoth equipment like the port's 2 gantry cranes were installed.
Those all put up at the same time as the warehouses, and those were some of the last cranes built by Clyde Iron right here in Duluth.
Spin-off businesses on the waterfront were thriving, and the Port of Duluth Superior, the St. Lawrence Seaway, and places beyond were all poised for a very bright future.
I think in the long run, the Seaway will prove to be the same kind of a national asset as the Panama Canal was. And though in the short range it might cause some difficulties, in the long range I think it's going to lift the prosperity of the entire country.
Funding for Lost 50s is provided by the citizens of Minnesota through the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund.